I'm a Black feminist, capital B, capital S. I'm unapologetically Black and I'm unapologetically a feminist. And look, depending on what circles you're in, it's hard to be both those things at the same time. But I think that being both those things is the thing that will save us.
It's like we got a demo tape and nobody want to hear it, but it's like this is South got something to say.
Hi, my name is Kevin Blackistone, alongside Dr. Robert Greene II.
Welcome to the award-winning podcast, Our New South, presented by the Levine Museum of the New South in Charlotte, North Carolina.
The Levine Museum connects the past to the future to realize the promises of a new South.
All the show, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and here in Season 3, you can watch our conversations right here on YouTube.
All right, let's get to today's show.
Dr. Brittney Cooper, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Our New South. And I just have to say, I'm a big fan of your work. I got turned on to you through Crunk Feminist, of course, back when blogs were blogs, and you all would dip into my interests, which is sports from time to time, and with some different takes, and I was always just so impressed and really drawn to your work. So thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you.
And I have to ask you, you've accomplished a number of things. You do a number of things. You're a professor, you're a cultural critic, published writer, always in demand to speak and share your thoughts and wisdom. And then I look at the top of your social media platforms, and you always point out that you are a Southerner. Why is it so important for you, from Ruston, Louisiana, by the way, to point out those roots?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I was delighted to get this invitation because I have lived in the North, particularly in New Jersey, for almost 15 years. And there is a way that it is really important to me to remind people that I am a Southerner. And I'm from a particular Southern experience. I am not from the big city South, because everybody loved Atlanta. Everybody loved Dallas and Houston and Charlotte, right? I am from the small town deep South. The place where my mom is from and where she took me, where I was the first couple of years of my life, is actually not even Ruston. It is a small place in Lincoln Parish that was classified as a village in the census because it has so few people. And it is what I call my ancestral homeland. My grandmother had land there. We still have family land there. My great grandmother and her siblings all bought this land and they raised their children next door to each other. So there's about a mile stretch in the parish where all of the people are kin to me. And so then when my mom grew up and, she had me as a young person, and when she launched into adulthood, she moved 8 miles up the road to the big city of Ruston, which is a town at that time of about 20,000 people. It's a college town. It's where I went to school, kindergarten through high school. And so I grew up in the small town, college town, deep South. And I also grew up in a part of Louisiana that is not New Orleans, that is far from New Orleans. And so when people say, oh, you're from Louisiana, they say, I love New Orleans. And I say, well, it's fine. But for me, New Orleans was a big urban area, a city. It had a bunch of culture, but it is related, but it's a distinctive South from the South that I knew, where rurality is really, I know how to help my grandmama pick a chicken, right? My grandmother raised pigs and she raised 2 hogs every year, a calf every year. And she picked chickens for the local chicken plant. And that's why our family was always fed. My parents, to this day, have both a refrigerator and a deep freezer in their kitchen, right? Those are my kind of Southern people. Yeah.
And that actually takes me to my next question, which is, you've talked a lot already about the importance of family to your life and to your social upbringing. Could you talk a bit more about that? And in particular, what it means for the importance of Black family in the rural South, because you've been very explicit that you're talking about the rural Black experience here.
I think that I grew up in this multi-generational community. So
Mhm.
so I know my second, third, fourth cousins, right? I can, just go home and meet people deeply related to the family tree. And sometimes one of the like disorienting experiences of being a teacher, a professor of Black studies in the Northeast is that there is this fascination, and I would say fetishization of a kind of cosmopolitan Blackness, right? So a
Mm.
kind of Blackness that is international and diasporic, and not a Blackness that is rooted in the story of American slavery and of the Deep South. There has been a sort of walking away from that story, this sense that the American South overdetermined our narratives about Black identity. And so this like scholarly desire to, expand the narratives. I'm not opposed to that. But I also think that there is a walking away from the richness of this. And I'm like, look, I grew up among rural working class people, and that affects everything that I do. And it affects how I read experiences, right?
Mm.
So I don't think of rural people as backwards. I don't think of them as unsophisticated. I don't think of them as people who don't have a critical perspective on the world. And so it feels really important for me to say, I come from this land. These are my people. And the things you do there affect real folks with real thoughts, real political investments who have meaning. And that's so I try to use the scholarly tools I have to think very much about what this means for the place that I'm from. And some of it rings true. And then some of it just doesn't ring true, some of the, like when folks are like, because gun violence. And I was like, I saw a lot of gun violence. But some of that is because there's just guns around. My grandmother had a rifle the minute you walked in the house, right? Like it was in the door jamb. And it was both a mode of protection from, people who might try to break in, but also you might walk out on your doorstep and see a rattlesnake, like honestly, I'm not being hyperbolic,
Right. Mhm.
you might walk out and have to do battle with with an apex predator of some kind. And, and you had to be prepared to be able to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, and just as a quick follow-up to that, you've already made clear how complicated the rural South is, but I'm curious to know, what are some other things you want listeners to know about the South that they might not really know much about, especially as you just talked about the rural South in particular?
A lot of the things that I'm thinking about, some friends have challenged me to think about I'm a scholar of Black feminisms. And so
Right.
what does it
Mhm.
mean to think about gender, and to think about what Southern feminisms look like? I think for me, the thing that becomes interesting and that I've sort of arrived at is that I grew up with women who practiced feminism even when they didn't have the language for it, right?
Ah, right.
This is why when initially I read feminism, I was like, well, what do y'all mean patriarchy? Because women lead everything where I'm from. Like, who are these male leaders and what are they doing? Right. I was able to access it when I thought about issues around violence and also the ways that women were always negotiating men's either disruptive or chaotic presence or their utter absence, right? And the ways that that produced particular kinds of vulnerability. But again, I just said, like, my grandmother kept a rifle. My great grandmother would tell stories about how to chop off the head of a rattlesnake with a shovel. So I'd never had these notions of gender that were rooted in a kind of white femininity. I didn't have a notion of gender that said that I got to be like soft and in that way, or what's the word? Fragile, right? I don't come from
Mhm.
fragile women. And so these sort of narratives of white Southern fragility that have powered so much of how we understand gender, that's just not how women who live in the wild get down. They will not survive in that way. I write very strongly against white supremacy. Everyone knows that. But I stayed in the houses of white people as a kid. My mother had white homegirls. They were working class white ladies, right? But they were rough and tumble white girls. And so rough and tumble white boys and Black boys, rough and tumble white girls and Black girls, they get down together in the South. Now they go in the voting booth and they make very different choices. I tell my colleagues all the time, I said, sometimes when I live up north, I live in a generally blue state. I was like, my colleagues will go into the voting booth and they will make choices that are in the main better for Black folks, but they don't actually have any deep socialities with Black or brown people, right? I'm not trying to romanticize the South. I'm not trying to romanticize white people in the South, but I am saying that I do think that white Southern folk and Black Southern folk and folk of color have figured out forms of intimate sociality, probably because of histories of the plantation and what does it mean to survive these landscapes, that mean that sometimes we actually have more genuine social relationships with each other than what you see when you're up north. And to me, that really matters. So I didn't grow up outside of being in relationship to white people, or, and even my mom, they had these conversations in the office, right? And talked about why they voted in particular ways and how things were different. And I think that when white Southerners get caricatured as just kind of KKK, gun-toting racists, this is why Northerners don't know how to win them over. This is why kind of blue politicians don't know how to articulate a narrative towards them that actually might be compelling. Because I'm like, y'all don't actually have any real relationships or understanding. And that's not an easy story. And I'm not saying that I have the solution to that, but I am saying that I know who to call if my truck gets stuck in a ditch. And it's somebody that might pull up with a Confederate flag bumper sticker on the back, and they will be some of the nicest people you have ever met. And it is a complete and total form of cognitive dissonance. And yet for me, that feels like home too.
And this is, if I'm not mistaken, the Eloquent Rage, which was the name of your book, right? Where you really kind of expand on this idea of radical feminism or Black womanism, however you'd like to put it. So I'm just wondering, since you talked about Howard, and what it meant to you going there, how did Howard University, and maybe even coming to Washington, D.C., which is a different sort of Southern city, help shape your view of women and help you hone this idea of radical feminism?
First of all, Howard actually expanded my conception of the South, because when I first went to DC, my grandmother would she would say, well, how is it upstate? It's so far away in land area, right? In literal physical distance from the deep South, that my people think of Washington, D.C. as the North. And honestly, I kind of do too. So that's one of the things that Howard did, was help me to understand my own Southern identity in a better way, and to start to come. I mean, one of the ways that that our shared colleague Frankie Abbott, that our experience together, we went to grad school together, and there was like a Southern Studies working group, and that was the place that I learned post Howard about like that there were many Souths, because I didn't have the language for that. So Howard helped me to think more robustly about the South. Howard also gave me a framework for healing and thinking about, look, let me not romanticize small town life. On the one hand, it was deeply grounding. On the other hand, one of my things my mom also always said to me is there's a world much bigger than Ruston, and sometimes small towns breed small minds. And so because I was a nerdy Black girl who got pegged early as being quote unquote gifted and placed into these like very racially stratified classes with mostly white kids, and then there would be me and maybe a couple of others of us, that set me at odds with my peer group in my community. And I was often bullied, told that I was acting white, told that I wanted to be white. That was also part of my growing up experience in this kind of small place. It shaped the entirety of my childhood. And so walking onto campus at Howard, where I didn't have white kids telling me, you're not like the other Black kids, right? And I didn't have Black kids saying, you want to be white. And all of a sudden my nerdiness just made sense, right? I was there with a bunch of smart, driven, ambitious students. It healed the anti-Blackness that I also experienced, because you cannot grow up in that kind of racial stratification and not imbibe some of it. So it healed the narratives around Blackness that I had. I wasn't a feminist at Howard though. And I didn't necessarily get all the tools to be a feminist at Howard. When I was at Howard, which was from 1998 to 2002, it was a very particular place. It was still in the, the sort of wake of its Black nationalist past. Now, it's a real different place today, I'm happy to say, much more gender progressive. The last time I was on campus, one or 2 years ago, the head of the Howard University Student Association was a trans woman who's super dynamic. That was not even a possibility when I was a student there at the turn of the century, right? It was in my senior year at Howard that I was popping off and talking about how I was not a feminist. At best, I was a womanist in Alice Walker's rendering of that term. Because I thought, feminism was white women's shit, to quote my 20-year-old uninformed self. And one of my Howard colleagues and friends was like, "Girl, read a book. That's actually why you sound crazy. That's not correct." And so I would go on a feminist journey after Howard, but the thing that I love is that the women that I wrote about all had a connection to Howard. So Mary Church Terrell, Anna Julia Cooper, the gender non-binary activist Pauli Murray as a Howard alum. Anna Julia Cooper and Mary Church Terrell's houses literally on T Street over near Howard in LaDroit Park. So they sort of beckoned me to themselves eventually, right? I had a couple of people whisper their names or bring them up or say, I had one professor at Howard when I said, I'm kind of interested in the women. And she said, "Oh, you need to read Paula Giddings' book, When and Where I Enter," because she really does that. So Howard planted good seeds on good soil so that I would be positioned to sort of come into my kind of feminist understanding. But I think that I was really reveling in the deep, loving Blackness of Howard. And I wasn't able to see the fissures around gender while I was there, and so it was a reckoning that I had to stage in my scholarly life after I left.
So you kind of mentioned it here. You've become known, particularly with Crunk Feminists, as being unapologetic about your Blackness. In fact, and that's another thing you list on some of your social platforms, that you're a shit talker. So how did you develop the strength, the confidence to do that? And how much of that goes back to your upbringing in the rural South with all the Black women that you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it. There came a time when, my mom passed away a couple of years ago, but she would call me whenever I was on MSNBC and I would be giving people the what for about white supremacy or whatever. And, and getting all of the negative reactions that came because of it. And she would call me and she was like, your aunt and I were talking about you and just wondering how you got where you have the audacity to say this stuff. Like, why do you just feel that you can say whatever you want to say? And, and she wasn't chastising me. She was saying, like, we admire it. We're also confounded by it. And I was like, are y'all confounded? You said anything you wanted to say pretty much to people. Right. And then finally one day she calls and she says, when I was talking to your aunt, she said, well, we did used to leave her down there in the country with mama and, and my great grandmother, little mama. And they would tell people anything. And I was like, correct. That is my Southern sensibility showing up. And it shows up sometimes in the language of a PhD, but the confidence that I have the right to stand in these places and say it is because I was raised by people who had a deep and deeply rooted sense of their own dignity, right? That wasn't determined by what white people said about them. That wasn't determined by whether white people thought they were human or less than. I didn't grow up in a world where folks were negotiating day to day white people's ideas about them. They were just being themselves and running their lives. And so a lot of times I see white supremacy as an intrusion on Black living, and therefore I treat it as such. Right? I do not see it as the thing that determines my being, my meaning, even my political work in the world. I see it as a kind of annoying intrusion that always has to be negotiated when I would rather be engaged in these kind of, these more interesting and exciting forms of Black sociality. What are Black folks doing? What are we talking about? And sometimes, I find like when I do TV and then I'm out and about and people know me, it's always elder Black women. They're like, we love you so much. And I was like, it's because they recognize me as the kind of daughter that they would have raised. And that's my highest honor, right? is that when I am seen on the news or I'm seen in these places, that elder Black people and everyday Black folks are like, you speak for me. I can't think of a higher honor than that.
No, and I think that's really important and integral to your work. And I have to say, as someone who studies intellectual history for a living, I know you actually best not only through Crunk Feminism, but also through your book, Beyond Respectability, the intellectual thought of race women. And that book was really important for me as a grad student and as a young scholar of history, because you really talk about the folks you just mentioned, Mary Church Terrell and others, Angela Cooper, Pauli Murray, and so many other Black women who were doing this kind of work in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I'm curious, you've spoken a lot this afternoon about how living and growing up in the South has really shaped your worldview. But could you talk a little bit more about how that Southernness really influences your brand of feminism? And who do you think today best represents that kind of Southern feminism?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for bringing up Beyond Respectability. That I love that book. I love those women. I came to grad school to like study post-coloniality and Black literature or something.
Oh.
And then I ran upon the women and I was like, what? And I was so excited. And it's not coincidental that all of those women are Southern in the most expansive sense of it. Mary Church Terrell is from Tennessee. Ida B. Wells is from Mississippi. Pauli Murray's from Baltimore. And so all of those women, the women that are really kind of Anna Julia Cooper's from North Carolina, right? They're all these Southern women from the most expansive conception of the South. What I love about those women is both their willingness to be confrontational. They were truth tellers. They didn't mince words with anybody, whether they were talking about the problems of gender in Black communities and saying our people deserve better than this. They started movements and they spoke with fire, but they also were institution builders, right? So in that way, they felt familiar to me. Most of these women were churchy. Despite all of my academic training, I remain a churchy Black girl. It is one of those forms of sociality that you kind of can't, for me, it has felt important to stick with it. Not so much because of theology necessarily, but because I think that there's some kind of magic that our folks are doing when they figure out spiritually how to keep on surviving. And so I want to be always in one of the spaces where that kind of work is happening. And so Pauli Murray ultimately becomes the first Black woman to be ordained, as a priest in the Episcopal Church, just as an example. So those women all, they tick off these boxes around institution building, around community, but also around deep confrontation. And I think sometimes we forget that radical movements for racial justice in this country come out of the Deep South. We get to claim that sort of radical sensibility. And that, I think, influences the kind of feminism that I do. There's a version of feminism that is really meant to speak in academic terms. I'm thankful for it. It's why I have my job. That isn't the same thing as everyday feminist practice and politics that says Black girls matter, that says, where are our marches when Black girls are getting killed by police, that says, what's happening to Black girls with these school dress codes and with these, policing of their hair and things like that, right? So I think that today, when I think about Southern feminists that I love, I'm mostly thinking about organizations, actually. So I'm thinking about Sister Song Reproductive Justice Collective in Atlanta. I'm thinking about Southerners on New Ground who are really doing work around queer issues, right? I'm thinking about all of the reproductive justice battles that are happening in Louisiana and Texas and throughout the South.
Yeah, and I know Kevin's going to ask a follow-up about what you just mentioned about some of those women in a moment, but I do want to briefly pivot to your work as an educator in particular, because you've also been critical in recent years of book bans, especially across the South, that have been targeting works by minorities, works by Black, Latino, LGBTQ, and other communities in public schools and libraries. What impact do you think these bans could have on education, especially in the South? Because as you've already noted, knowing how to read and write, of course, is an important part of being Black in America. We're the only group that weren't allowed to do that for a long time. But certainly there's now an attempt to rewrite Southern history, Black history, American history. What do you think these book bans are trying to accomplish, and how do you think they could be stopped?
I think that the systematic undereducation of a people is the easiest way to control them. I don't even think we need a sophisticated explanation. I already think we know what the playbook is. This is the thing that one of my sort of sensibilities around being radical is just to be completely and consistently underimpressed with white supremacy. Like, I am not a person who says, oh, look at these people playing the long game. I don't think they're playing the long game. I think our people who have survived their centuries-long assault are people who are the ones playing the long game, because we've figured out how to last despite all these attempts to exterminate us. And I don't think they have long game, and I don't think they're sophisticated. I think that they just become violent when all of their machinations don't work. That is not a thing that we should be impressed with. And part of what that means in terms of your question is, so when you have a situation where, like, I live in New Jersey, where basically kids get a private school education because property taxes are so high that public schools here are essentially, run with the kind of money that private schools would run with everywhere else. You don't have that kind of educational structure in places like where I'm from, where there's not that much money spent per child on education, where there is this retrograde attempt to like have people put the 10 commandments back on every wall. And I came up in these schools in a moment where we prayed before every football game. It was very Friday Night Lights kind of situation, so I'm not, I have grown up in a world where Christian nationalism wasn't on the banner of the school, but it was certainly in the aesthetics and the ethos of the places. In that way, it is not particularly new. What I think is so dangerous in this moment is that we have forgotten, and that is by design, what our people did when we couldn't read books about us. I am of the generation, a person born in 1980. I didn't grow up reading a bunch of books by Black people in school. People didn't talk about Black history in school. You know how I learned? I have one aunt who lives in Dallas, Texas, and there was a Black-owned bookstore, and she would go there and buy me books, and she would ship them to me. But that's what the power of books can do. And so when our people are distressed about these book bans, one of the things I want to remind people is it has been a very limited amount of time that we've had all of this progress in our classrooms. And the way that we have dealt with it is that our community has figured out ways to educate our kids. They have read the books. Radical librarians read the books anyway. We have books and breakfast parties. Somebody's needs to be the community auntie and make sure that at holiday time, the kids get loaded up with books that they can read at home, that they can bring to school and take back home, that are going to give them a different kind of resistance. And I also started writing children's books. So I have written one storybook. I have another storybook coming out next year. And I also have a 4-part middle grade series for middle school girls about 3 Black girls who are friends and who get into a bunch of shenanigans that will also, the first in that series will drop next year as well. And so I think that those of us who have access have to also take the most expansive approach, right?
Getting a little bit back to what you said about politics in the South. Back in 2021, you wrote this article and it was titled, "Georgia is just the beginning. It's time to tell a new story about the South." What is that new story that needs to be told right now about the South?
So I think that Southern people are hungry for a system of enfranchisement that will actually allow them to vote their interest. And I think that's why you see this massive repression happening. You don't have to randomly redistrict your state in the middle of a redistricting cycle, Texas, if you don't start to see the seeds of dissent. So it is not the South that is holding the country back. As the South goes, the rest of the country goes. And the opportunities available to Southern people are the opportunities that are going to be available to all of us. And if we sit around and we watch fascism take hold in the South, as we have done, we're only one step away from it taking hold in other places. The South is multicultural. It is deeply filled with immigrant communities increasingly. It can be the place that is the vanguard of the kind of remaking of an actually functional multiracial American democracy. there's also a reason that people are leaving the North in droves and moving South. And some of that, which is a thing I love, is because people don't want to live on top of each other. People want space. People want affordability. People want, a decent quality of life. Folks actually want communities of care where folks know what it looks like to take care of each other. I think Southerners are actually just better at that than any other region in the country. And I've traveled to most regions of this country. And I don't think that it's fake. I think it's genuine. And I think if we figure out the right way to tether that kind of Southern hospitality, that kind of sense of communalism to a broader politic, we will be okay.
I am curious as to when you hear, for example, folks talk about the future of the South. What do you think about? Like, what do you see as being the future of the South, especially as we talk about how the rural South has been largely ignored in this larger narrative?
That I don't know. And here's why. It's not that I don't think Southern folks have a future. The thing that I'm more concerned about, even than the rural South being overlooked, is the failure to deal with climate change. I'm very concerned about this because I'm from Louisiana, because I'm from a place that is badly affected by hurricanes, but also badly affected by heat. The sort of, I'd like to remind people sometimes, we had seasons in Louisiana when I was a kid. There were years when I needed a coat at Christmas time when it was actually cold outside. And I have rapidly seen the shifting of climate in my lifetime so that it's warm all the time there. And I just know that this is not a sustainable way to be. So I think that the South has to be in the lead of our national conversation about climate change. I think that's why we have to have a massive movement to stop the installing of these data centers down South, because I think that they are meant to bring about climate catastrophe in places that have already been overlooked. And I think that part of the future of the South is that you're going to see folks wanting to get out of the grips of these big corporations and going back to the kinds of relationships to local supply chains in order to get things made, because global supply chains are becoming increasingly unreliable. I think that Southern people have a sensibility around local supply chains because they're still folks who are deeply connected to the land. And I think that sensibility about how to relate to the planet is actually going to be really important for the new ecologies that we have to build in order to survive the climate change conditions.
It's interesting you mentioned going through seasons when you were growing up in Louisiana. I went through a night in Shreveport in 2000 when a blizzard hit during the Independence Bowl, and that was not a lot of fun. I'm just one last question. How do you incorporate your Southernness into the teaching that you do at Rutgers and have been doing for the last 15 years? And do you yearn to come back to the South and do your work there?
Look, I teach about the women that I write about. And in that way, I think I'm always talking about the South as a place that informs Black radical tradition and Black feminist tradition. I teach Black intellectual thought. I'm in Africana studies, and then I teach Black feminism and women's and gender studies. And so I'm never not thinking about the South. Y'all are talking to me in a season of deep grief. I've had a lot of loss in the last 5 years. Both of my parents have passed away, and my grandmother has passed away, and some other family members. And so right now, being home reminds me of all of the possibilities that can no longer be. So there was a time in my career when my deepest desire was to come back South. I was like, I'm going to hang out here in the North and, do the things I need to do. And then I'm going to go live closer to my people. It's less my desire now. And that primarily is about grief. Also, though, I don't know that the Deep South university system is a great place for a radical Black feminist to be right now. And I am pragmatic, and I know that there are some safer places to do this work and there are some less safe places to do this work. and I'm looking at the kinds of fascist regulations that my colleagues who work in Southern universities are having to deal with. I have close friends who work in Texas, who work in Tennessee, who work in Alabama, who work in Georgia, and the kinds of negotiations they're having to make have not yet reached my doorstep in New Jersey. I'm also clear, however, that New Jersey swung really right in 2024. And then I learned that it was the last state to ratify the 13th Amendment. So slavery and its afterlives creep around the edges of the North too, and there is no place that is super safe. So I'm not saying I would never come back South, but right now I think that if I can bring the South with me into every room I'm in and have a modicum of safety to try to do the radical truth telling I can while I can, then, being here in the North, like Ida B. Wells, who had to abscond to the North after she called out the lynchers, is sort of what's required right now.
And before we get to our rapid fire questions, because I really want to hear your answers to some of these rapid fire questions, I have another brief question that we ask to every guest. I've asked you about the future of the South, and we've asked you about your upbringing in the South.
Yeah.
But what does the phrase "the New South" mean to you in particular?
Oh, that's good. I mean, what I think it means is that the New South is Black, the New South is Indigenous, the New South is Latinx, the New South is Asian, the New South is African. The New South is not Confederate. The New South is not enamored of a Southern past that is rooted in the subjugation of people, but understands its bounty is being connected to the land, being connected to a hospitable relationship between land and people.
Well, thank you so much for those wonderful answers. And I think we could talk all day about Grambling, about Howard. We could just spend time talking about HBCUs, but I do want us to get to these rapid fire questions because Kevin and I really enjoy doing these. And the first question for you, just answer as soon as you have an answer pop in your head, is where is your favorite place to be in the South?
Oh, Atlanta.
Really? After all this time talking about the rural South.
Listen, I helped found the Crunk Feminist Collective. Why are you shocked?
You're right. That's a good point.
Sweet tea or Arnold Palmer?
Sweet tea.
What's your favorite Southern word or phrase?
Y'all.
Who is your favorite Southerner, living or dead?
I don't know. Favorite? I don't really pick favorites. It probably have to be one of my aunties, honestly. My people. It's always my people.
And finally, what's the most underrated Southern food?
The thing that popped into my head is Southern made donuts from Shreveport. Actually, they're like some of the best donuts that I've ever had. Also, controversial hot take. I feel like red velvet cake is New South and not in a good way. Like, I didn't grow up eating that. I feel like it's some newfangled 21st century stuff. And I don't think, in my part of the South, we didn't eat no red velvet cake. So I just, I don't understand people's obsession with it.
I have one more question for you because we didn't get into your hip hop analysis. But who's your favorite hip hop group?
OutKast. You already know.
Of course. There you go. There you go.
Look, they just got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. I love OutKast. I love Andre 3000. I just think he is brilliant. I think they're brilliant together. I think they're the voice of a generation. I also think that they are Afrofuturism in form. And I think that when people are like, why didn't they put out more albums? I'm like, because y'all are still catching up to them. Like, people have not actually caught up to the work that they put out through the entirety of the 90s. And so I understand, being bored with the culture and wanting to push it, forward in particular ways. I also think it matters to say too that Erykah Badu is also from Dallas, that she's and that she went to Grambling, and that when we think about, her influence, that kind of neo soul rhythm is still, deep fried, laid to the side, kind of Southern sound, I grew up on New Orleans bounce. So even in the days before Big Freedia, and I do think it's worth saying, if we think about gender in the South just a bit, is New Orleans hip hop is super interesting because its gender performances have always been more fluid, more queer, more expansive than I think people would imagine. And so years ago, one of the things I did at the Crunk Feminist Collective was wrote this genealogy of twerking. Because when I grew up in Louisiana in the 80s and 90s and went to parties, dudes twerked at parties, and it wasn't a marker of their, sexuality, whether queer or straight. It was only a marker of sexual prowess, right? And I had these memories of my older stepsister who was a cool kid, just having dance-offs with the boys in her class, right? And they would be doing this to New Orleans bounce, or what technically, was called in the early 2000s sissy rap. Not sure if it's called that today because, it's a weird term. But, Big Freedia comes out of a tradition, right, of Black trans rappers in New Orleans who were mainstreamed and played on the radio when I was a kid. Katie Red being just one example of them, right? So there's a queerness in Southern bounce music. And there's a reason why every rapper from, post-Juvenile, whether we're talking about Drake, whether we're talking about T.I., right, they all do these songs over this bounce beat. And so that's also the sound of a generation. And I think that folks don't give New Orleans and Louisiana enough credit for being the genesis of a kind of open queer presence, an open, gender fluidity. And one of the things that I hated growing up, coming of age through the other thing I love about Southern hip hop is it's party music. I have not been to a party that is hype until a Southern beat drops. I'm sorry. I live in the North. I know that these people think that the music is wonderful. It's fine. You know what I mean? It's gotten better. And so that's my soundtrack is Southern hip hop music, is Houston, is Memphis, is New Orleans, and then secondarily Georgia. And look, and I was, Atlanta is one of my favorite places because it was the place where I was able to meld all the Southern parts of myself, the feminism. I became a feminist in Atlanta. And so when I got to go do a PhD there, it was the place where all the pieces kind of came together. And so I go back there and I was like, this is where you could speak your grandmama's language and the language of these professors and the language of the academy. And you could always find people to vibe with you on that. And then you could go to club and shake your ass. And so that's why I love it.
That is a tremendous closer. And I'd love to talk more to you about that. I mean, how you broke down what ratchet means and you flipped the script on Lil Boozy. I mean, all that stuff is great stuff.
I mean, all I will say is, as long as you don't start playing Bia Bia, we should be fine.
I mean,
that song is, I think, beyond the pale.
I promise you that will not happen. It does play. It is in regular rotation. In any playlist that I have. So, I raise you. Let's go.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation.
It has been a true pleasure.
This is more than we anticipated. This is fantastic. And I'm sure your students must love your classes at Rutgers.
I do my best.
Thank you so much.
A pleasure. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
You know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and don't nobody want to hear it, but it's like this is South got something to say.
Our New South is presented by Levine Museum of the New South. Levine Museum connects the past to the future to realize the promises of a New South. To learn more and donate to projects like this, visit museumoftheNewSouth.org.
Our New South is produced by Next Chapter Podcast. Thanks to our audio editor, sound designer, and composer, Hal Murdoch, video editor, Justin Cortez, producers Brian Douglas, Alexander Pineras, and Cliff Whitfield, senior producer and writer Byron Hunter, and executive producers Jeremiah Tittle and Frank the Abbott. Please follow the show, subscribe, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and watch portions of our interviews on YouTube.
Go to youtube.com and search Levine Museum.
Learn more at nextchapterpodcast.com/Our New South.
South got something to say.
Thanks for listening.